Afternoon. We're just going straight into our next session because Kiran Nagarkar has a flight to catch. So I'd like to welcome the panel for Emergency at 40. We'll start with the youngest first, Ashok Malik. Ashok? The youngest is always the hardest to find. Rudrangshu Mukherjee. I think then it would be Kiran, at least he's younger than at heart. And last, Sunanda K, Datta-Ray.
More attractive than a discussion on the emergency. I'll start with Sunanda Datta-Ray because in a sense he was right in the midst of things. He was then working in the Statesman and he was also writing from the Observer. He spent a lot of time in Delhi in the course of those 18 months. But I'll ask him a question that is somewhat of a preview to the emergency. In the existing narratives that we have of the emergency, it often seems to me that this was a regime that kind of emerged out of a series of conjunctural events, but working within from one of India's leading newspapers and with networks and contacts that you have always had. Did you have any sense that this was coming?
We knew when Mrs. Gandhi lost the Allahabad High Court case that she would do something drastic, some way whereby she could retain power. And I remember discussing this with I wrote a long piece on the Observer to say that she believed she had done nothing right. I quoted her, "People might say I've been a dictator, but I wasn't a dictator for myself, I did it only for my country." Whether you believe it or not is immaterial. She believed it, and I knew that she would do something, probably within the bounds of the law, to ensure that she continued in power. And I discussed this with a colleague, and he said, "Oh no, she can't. Under the law, she can declare Indira Gandhi a national monument tomorrow, but how can she do it?" And I said, "Why can't she? Who's to say her nay?" Because when the chips are down, no one really objects. No one stands against the forces of authority. And so the precise form in which she saved her job and her position, I can't pretend that I expected.
But India in 76 was already under a form of emergency. She only made an external emergency into an internal emergency. Am I right in saying that?
Technically, yes, but that emergency didn't have any domestic impact. The external emergency didn't inspire fear, didn't make the trains run on time, to quote someone, didn't provide India with a smack of firm government, to quote Michael Foot. It had no resonance within the country. This one did. This one gave the government absolute power, Mrs. Gandhi and even more perhaps her henchmen, absolute power to do what they wanted.
Ashok Malik, there is a trend of thought in Indian politics, not just in Indian politics, particularly among some of the army and armed forces people, that what India needs is a strong government. The definition of what is a strong government is kind of left vague or undefined. Where does one draw the line between a strong government and the government of the kind that we had in an emergency, in the way the state wields power?
There's always a search for an authoritative government. That does not, of course, mean the same as an authoritarian government, which is the type we got between 75 and 77. I do believe that India's very competitive political environment, which is much more competitive today than it was in 75, makes that search for a so-called strongman government even more difficult and even more, in a sense, risky. Because I'm not sure a single strongman government from a central location such as a national capital can any longer really control and expect the rest of the country to just play along if very harsh and even if legally permissible, which the emergency was at the time it was imposed, morally very dodgy regime is imposed.
So this is then in one of the lessons that Indian politics or the Indian polity has learned from the emergency, that you cannot actually no longer have a strong center that can rule, irrespective of what is happening elsewhere in the country.
Well, yes, you should have an authoritative and efficient central government, as you should have state governments, but that by itself can no longer ensure that people will just accept an emergency. They didn't accept one in 77 either, and the people did speak. I think the experience since then has made all of us wiser. It would certainly has made the Congress wiser. Till 77, the Congress really hadn't faced reverses, electoral reverses of a serious nature, other than in the late 60s. But it still came back to power. The fact that people responded and rejected what was overdone policing, if nothing else, in the emergency years with that mandate in 77 was a shock to a lot of people and showed a certain maturing of Indian politics and of the Indian people. That apart, between 75 or 77 and now, as I said, our politics has turned much more competitive. Mrs. Gandhi had 2 state governments to dismiss, Gujarat and Tamil Nadu in 75. An emergency imposed today, if someone were to do that, would require about 20 governments or maybe 15 governments to be dismissed, which is much more difficult. You'd have many more people on the streets. Finally, Mrs. Gandhi could impose the emergency because we were essentially an autarkic economy at that point, not integrated with the world, not integrated in terms of media and technology because that didn't exist, not integrated in terms of trade. Today we are much more linked, integrated to the world, and also much more vulnerable. And I use vulnerable here as a positive attribute.
So, in fact, what you're suggesting is that an emergency 40 years since it happened is practically an impossibility.
It would be much more difficult to impose or to maintain.
Sunanda K, would you agree with that?
Maintenance is a different matter. The instincts are there still, and long ago someone said that the only difference between Indira Gandhi and Chaudhary Charan Singh was that one was a successful dictator and one wasn't. I think that could be said of all Indian politicians still. The instinct is there and the provisions are there also within the law. Let us not forget that the emergency didn't in any way contravene the law of the land, and those provisions still exist, so it could be done. Ashok is saying that because of our integration with the global economy, it would make it difficult. Sanctions could be applied. Yes, perhaps those could happen. But it would take time, and if we had a Prime Minister who was so minded, we could still have the same sort of state again. And I'd differ with Ashok on one thing, that all Indian governments are authoritarian to the extent that they can get away with it. Mrs. Gandhi could get away with it, the present Prime Minister can get away with it. In between there have been Prime Ministers who haven't been able to get away with it, but no Prime Minister who is voluntarily inclined to share power. No Indian Prime Minister so far has been voluntarily inclined to share power, share authority, or observe the spirit of the Constitution as opposed to its law.
I'll come back to this point a little later. Kiran has to leave early, so I'll turn to him. Am I wrong in saying that in one very major sense, you were a victim of the emergency?
Yeah, I was. But if I may go back to what you were discussing, we were talking about prime ministers and governments having a tendency towards authoritarian rule. But I think what we are not mentioning is that every now and then you're walking somewhere or you're sitting somewhere with a group of people, and there is a subterranean yearning for, as you mentioned earlier, for a strong man or woman at the top. And I don't want to dismiss this that easily, because there is this incredible belief that if a strong man comes and takes power, then things are going to get sorted out. I mean, I think this is, I have no idea whether any kind of education can ever get rid of this notion. But to come back to what you were saying, asking me.
Yeah, it's not very well known, so maybe you will tell us the circumstances of how you were a victim of the emergency and what form it took.
By about 1974 or 75, I was convinced that I had major problems regarding what was going on in the world, since at that time, whatever I read did not really prepare me for the fact that America, for instance, invariably happened to topple so many governments in Latin America and elsewhere. And the fact that the Vietnam struggle was still going on in a very strong fashion. When I read the biography of Ho Chi Minh, for the first time it struck me that it really doesn't matter when it comes to America whether a government is democratically elected. They keep talking non-stop about electing or wanting democracy to be a worldwide phenomenon. And this is a total lie. So when I understood this, I thought I have to write about personal responsibility for whatever happens within the country, in your own backyard, or anywhere else in the world. And so I started to write a play that came to be known as Bedtime Story. And what I did with Bedtime Story was to take 4 episodes from the Mahabharata, and I turned them inside out. At times, in the case of Ekalavya, for instance, Ekalavya comes across victorious. He is not at all rebellious in that sense, but when Dronacharya asks him for his thumb, he bends down, he picks up a bit of earth, spits into it, makes a thumb of that earth, and says, Jaisa Guru, Vaisi Guru Dakshina. So, we keep forgetting, first of all, that Ekalavya was a totally self-made man. And I think this is something that I cannot reiterate often enough. And that having taken that further step where he very politely but very severely puts down his guru. So there was an episode with Draupadi and the game of dice and all kinds of things. But the curious thing about the play was that there is a chorus. It is a wily chorus. He is truly a totally unreliable man. And it ends on a terrible note. Because what it does is that it holds the audience responsible for whatever happens to Draupadi or anybody else. And he takes it upon himself to at least metaphorically punish the audience. And of course the fact that I'm taking on, in a sense, Hindutva itself with the portrayal of Draupadi as a total rebel did not sit well. Dr. Lagu asked for various other experimental groups to come together and to listen to his reading. At that time he was quite a senior actor and director. But in Maharashtra you cannot perform a play until it has first been, you can't even do the first rehearsal until it is okayed by the censor board. And that's when my play ran into terrible trouble. It was legally and extra-legally banned. And even when the legal ban was taken off, what happened was that the extra-legal ban stayed in place. So that for 17 years it was not allowed to be performed, and when it was performed also, it was performed in the Fringe Theatre. And it took 38 years for the play to be printed.
So it's not specific to the emergency. It's certain, the ban was certain provisions that exist within the Maharashtra legal structure and the Maharashtra, the amount of freedom that that legal structure grants to artists.
I don't
That
think...
the fact that it took 38 years, I mean, the emergency went long before that.
Oh, yes, it did. But the point is that it was not just Maharashtra. It was not, I mean, you know, there was a publishing house, a very famous international publishing house, actually an academic one, which asked me for the play 4 times. And every time they backed out. So the play was not allowed to be performed anywhere else either, because it was not so much the Maharashtra thing as, you know, we are, if I may say something totally hypocritical, we are a very sensitive people.
Why do you say it's hypocritical?
Oh, because I don't mean it at all. I mean, what kind of sensitivity do we have that we can allow somebody to hang himself? I won't even mention the name.
You mean touchy?
To put it mildly. Yes.
We are prickly about certain kinds of criticism.
And we are, very
we are not genuinely sensitive.
No, not at all. And we are very competitive. Oh, those guys got away with it, then we must have. Yes. I mean, the police have a say in it. The doctors have a say in it. I wonder when ants and other small creatures will lodge a complaint one of these days.
May I ask a question?
Yes.
Wasn't there another Maharashtra play called A Touch of Brightness that
Yes.
was banned?
Yes.
Maharashtra seems to be rather more prickly than other states.
I'm from the same place, but I have to admit that you're right.
So to come back to this point, I think Kiran was also making the same thing. 3 of you can respond to this one by one. So there is a propensity within the Indian polity and with sanctions in the Indian constitution that creates this tension between the centralizing force represented by the Prime Minister and his powers and the more federal forces represented by the states. Ashok made this point very well a little while ago. So when a prime minister can break this tension, cut this tension off and actually concentrate powers in his own hands, he can emerge as an authoritative / authoritarian figure. Is that a viable way of putting it, Ashok?
You know, if you, obviously we're considering the situation as it is now rather than in 75.
No, let's go back to 75 also.
It was certainly true in 75. I think it's less true today, not because individuals have suddenly become much better people or reformed themselves, but because the federal structure of the polity, makes concentration of power in Delhi that much more difficult. It has not, however, as Mr. Nagarkar correctly points out, taken away from the tendency some of us seem to have in this country to look for a strong man. But that search for a strong man for many years now, perhaps the election of 2014 was an anomaly in that case because it was the first one where a single party won a mandate, a full mandate. That search for a strong man has now been transferred from Delhi to the states. If you consider our most successful chief ministers across political parties, each one of them is actually a mini dictator in his or her state. I won't name.
Would you agree with that, Mr. Sunanda?
Yes and no. I don't see that this is relevant to the emergency theme. This is sort of discussing the theory of Indian politics and to what extent it is in harmony with the practical nature of Indians.
It is relevant in this sense that the crucial questions that historians are still trying to figure out is, was the emergency, as I said at the very beginning, an outcome of certain events, or is there one or many propensities within the Indian polity that make such a phenomena possible? That is where this discussion is relevant, I think.
Well, the emergency was very much the outcome of a specific event. It was explained to Mrs. Gandhi after the Allahabad court judgment that she could remain Prime Minister for 6 months without being a member of the Lok Sabha. Knowing her party, knowing the persons around her, she knew that in those 6 months they would undermine her position and she wouldn't be able to come back. So she had to do something to retain her job. That specific catalyst caused the emergency, the proclamation of emergency. But yes, we are all authoritarians. As Edward VII famously said, we are all socialists nowadays. We've always all been authoritarian. Some get the chance, some don't. But as far as tension is concerned, during the emergency, I don't think there was tension between the states and the centre. State chief ministers, particularly of this state, took advantage of the emergency. A lot of Mrs. Gandhi's ministers, they made hay while the sun shone and paid off old scores. They arrested people who were not, the cases have been written of people going to the Prime Minister and saying, so-and-so's been arrested, and she said, why? And then it's turned out that someone in her cabinet, Om Mehta or V.C. Shukla, someone in power, maybe R.K. Dhawan, wanted that man's head. So there were all these little games being played out. They were not a product of tension, they were product of the opportunism that is India writ large.
Let me play the devil's advocate for a little bit. That let's take the situation from 1971 when Mrs. Gandhi is at the height of her power and to the coming of the emergency. What is actually going on? There is a singular process at work. Some people argue this was not the brainchild of Indira Gandhi, but it was actually the brainchild of a man called P.N. Haksar, who was her principal advisor, where power is being centralized through extra-constitutional means in the Prime Minister's office. I mean, Haksar, I think, has been the most powerful bureaucrat that this country has ever seen since independence. And his word was just short of law. And he could handle things in the bureaucracy, in the foreign office, in the judiciary. He could just about fix anything he wanted. So there is this process of centralizing power in the Prime Minister's office, not maybe in the person of the Prime Minister, but in her office. That process was very, very remarkable and distinct in the years just preceding the emergency. The emergency just concentrates that power in the hands of one individual rather than in the office of that individual.
Even before 70, I'll share an anecdote with you. I was the statesman's man in London, and the Commonwealth Prime Minister's conference was being held, and Indira Gandhi was due to speak at about 4 o'clock in the afternoon. And I said to Mr. Haksar that 4 in the afternoon is too late in India for me to make the next day's paper. So he said, come round to my suite in Claridge's Hotel, which I did. And he was in shirt sleeves and he was typing Mrs. Gandhi's speech on an old royal typewriter with 2 fingers. And her suite was next door, communicating door. Page by page as he typed it, he gave it to me and then he took it round. And I said to him, but suppose she doesn't deliver it. And he looked at me and he said, no one has ever doubted he wore half-moon spectacles. And he said, no one has ever doubted my word before. I don't know whether she delivered it exactly or not, but I wrote my story on the basis of the speech before she delivered it. But this accretion of power in the PMO, to which you rightly draw attention, was not new. Nehru's PMO, Nehru himself was the PMO. And it wasn't illegal in any way. It wasn't unconstitutional. We've had foreign ministers who didn't matter. I mean, not very long ago, we had a foreign minister who was happy for the PMO to take all decisions. As far as one can make out, the present foreign minister isn't any more assertive of her rights as foreign minister. So these things, these balances and checks continue within the government. I don't think that is a major drawback as far as the constitutionality of India is concerned. What is that processes aren't followed. Senator Adlai Stevenson once in a conversation said to me, you are very proud of your democracy, but what you really have is representative government. we in America have democracy because there's the democratic spirit imbues every branch and administration of the administration, whereas India is representative government, and that I think is right. An MLA represents some people, an MP represents some people, but they're not part of the machinery, the decision-making operational machinery of government. That's always been someone at the top who may or may not have confidants, may or may not have darbaris, but it's like that. It's a monarch with a darbar.
And then the million-dollar question, Ashok Malik, why do you think Mrs. Gandhi suddenly lifts the emergency and decides that she is going to go for elections?
Well, I am actually quite convinced that she felt she was going to win. Because by all the accounts I've read, Granville Austin, Kuldeep Nair and a few others, tell me that till very late she was quite surprised that people were even suggesting she would lose, though many in her party actually knew a loss was coming, but perhaps news was kept from her. And intelligence bureau reports, which can tell you whatever you want to hear, were seeming to indicate, at least the reports that went to her, that she was going to win. So I think the defeat and the magnitude of the defeat certainly took her by surprise. She probably wanted to legitimize the changes to the constitution that had been made by the 42nd Amendment, and during the emergency she thought she'd win this election and sort of to that end legitimize the changes she's made in her regime and in India's constitution, and win back some of the international goodwill she'd lost. There is the more romantic view that somewhere within this steely woman, Nehru's daughter rebelled and the spirit of Nehru came out. I'm not so sure. Politics is a more cynical game.
You'll have to leave? Okay. Yeah.
Please excuse me, I have a flight to catch. I'm really sorry. I just want to clarify one thing though. When Mrs. Gandhi declared that there was going to be an election, I thought this play had lost its relevance entirely. But I was to discover 11 months later that the Janata government had come in and the play had become even more relevant, because we did not even know what freedom meant and we abused it. There was competition about who should become Prime Minister, and they could not agree about a damn thing. And the other question was, what punishment should be meted out to Mrs. Gandhi? This is what they argued about, and let the people go to hell. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You know, Sunanda, you spoke about the henchmen that Mrs. Gandhi had and who wielded power to an unprecedented degree. So we have this phrase in Bengali that you're probably aware of, Babu joto kon parishod gon kon tar shotogune. I mean, it has to be Tagore, who else, but Tagore could utter such a line. So do you think a lot of the excesses that the emergency permitted was due to the henchmen, and actually these were not orders emanating from the top? And among the henchmen, I actually count Sanjay Gandhi.
Let me first address your earlier question about why she called the emergency, why she called elections. I won't pretend to have an answer, but I did ask her when she lived in 12 Wellington Crescent in disgrace, political exile, and no one visited her, so much so that my taxi driver said, "Wo koti mein kyun ja raha? Unke paas koi to aajkal nahi jata." And I asked her, why did you call the elections? Everyone said you were going to lose. And her reply was memorable. She said, one doesn't call elections to win, one calls elections because it's a democratic obligation. You can take it as you like it, but that's exactly what she said. As far as her henchman is concerned, whether she knew, I think she was too civilized to want to know. She would rather not know what was happening as long as the boat wasn't rocked. I mean, that's my personal assessment of the woman. I asked her once why they did the they took over Sikkim through a mixture of political hyperbole and populist tactics and military force measure. And she said, oh, but they hated the Chogyal. So she had this knack of turning everything into an artless Alice in Wonderland kind of explanation in which she was the innocent. And she would probably blot the unsavory things that happened during the emergency out of her mind. And you have to bear in mind there, what were the unsavory things that happened during the emergency and which cost the Congress its job? Nazbandi, vasectomy on a widespread scale in Uttar Pradesh, and the Turkmen Gate demolition. Both were principles of state policy, stated state policy. The Turkmen Gate demolitions had been ordered or sanctioned long before, it was just hadn't been carried out. And birth control, vasectomy was also one of the targets of the government. Now she would say, not that I know for sure, but I can guess that she would say, but these were stated government objectives. How can I decide how it's done? How can I supervise how government policy is implemented at the ground? No prime minister can do that. And that would have been her defense.
Yeah, but yes, the two sort of memorable excesses of the emergency are the two that you mentioned. But I remember growing up in the years of the emergency, there were certain other excesses that stuck in one's mind. The treatment meted out to Haksa's uncle, Pandit brothers, as a piece of pure personal vendetta.
But that was, you mentioned Sanjay Gandhi as one of her henchmen, and that was Sanjay Gandhi's doing.
Yes, and also take for example the fact this we got to know after the emergency, a fat man like Pilu Modi being imprisoned in a place that only had an Indian style toilet. I mean, these were very peculiar and odd excesses that were carried out, and it's difficult to believe, don't you think, that these were carried out in ignorance of Mrs. Gandhi, that she wasn't aware that these things were happening to very prominent people. Turkmen Gate, innocent people, poor, anonymous, they lose their homes. I mean, she can see it as, we say, one man's killing is a murder, and when a massacre takes place, that's state policy. So it was state policy, but what about what was done to certain individuals?
Well, I find myself in the awkward position.
No, you're not to defend it. No, that was not the purpose of my question at all. I know you're not a defender of the emergency, so why should I put you in that place? I'm asking you, as a very long-term observer of these things in Indian politics, do you have any kind of explanation that might help historians? You have written so much about the emergency, so I know you are not a defender of it, and you'll never will be.
I think she had the capacity to blot her mind out. That's why I said she was civilized. That was a euphemistic term. Blot things that were unpleasant out of her mind. They didn't happen if she chose not to happen. And also, possibly, she didn't look at detail. This is something Lee Kuan Yew told me. He met the curator of the botanical gardens in Bangalore. And he said that this man is highly qualified and he's paid a pittance and he does such a wonderful job. His salary should be raised and he should be given a more important charge. And he mentioned to Mrs. Gandhi. And she said, Harry, if I start thinking about curators of botanical gardens all over the country, I won't be able to attend to anything else. So she didn't want to think about small things, whereas Lee Kuan Yew would have thought of that small detail of governance because he would see it as part of the whole and affecting the quality and nature of his government. She didn't want to, and she would convince herself that it was never said to her at all.
To turn to a completely different theme, Ashok Malik, do you think they were strong enough, looking back now, this is wisdom after the event, looking back, do you think there were strong enough protests against the emergency, or did India India's political parties and leaders just take it too much lying down?
With very few exceptions, I'm afraid common people seem to accept the new regime and just shrug their shoulders. There was political opposition from, especially from the RSS network, which just and to some degree the left as well, not the CPI but other parties. There was Dr. Swami's famous, now almost romantic escape from Parliament, and there were, of course, many important politicians who were imprisoned. But protests from common people were frankly missing, and that remains a big question mark as to what may happen if such a situation were to arise again. I don't think it will. I don't think it's feasible, but that remains a puzzling question. And also, we take such pride in our institutions, but what happened to the judiciary? Chandrachud, A.N. Ray, Bhagwati, all stalwart individuals. What happened to them? They just they accepted the 42nd Amendment. They accepted preventive detention or detention without trial. They accepted this absurd notion that Niren Day came up with, that there is no rule of law outside the four walls of the Constitution. That remains, for someone who was much too young to actually remember the emergency, a very puzzling question.
There is this famous quote that when Chou En-lai was asked about the French Revolution, he said, "It's too early to tell." Do you think it's too early to tell about the emergency?
Well, Chou En-lai's reply, oft quoted, is mistakenly quoted. He wasn't referring to the French Revolution and the fall of the Bastille. Nixon had been talking to him just before that about the Sorbonne riots of 1968, and he referred to that. And it's gone down in history as Chou En-lai saying inscrutable Chinese wisdom, saying 250 years after the French Revolution, it's too early to say. If I may go back to a point you made earlier, Rudrangshu, about the centralizing trends, and I suddenly remembered, I should have remembered at the time, that sometime in the early 70s, before emergency, Mrs. Gandhi decided on a directly elected prime minister. And she thought that that would give India the kind of firm governance and continuity that India needed. The party, she thought, could be dispensed with. And she sent a number of lawyers, including a well-known Calcutta barrister Subrat Roy Chaudhary, abroad to study constitutions and decide advise her on whether this could be done in India or not. The Prime Minister directly elected by the people. And the final verdict was that the Supreme Court would never allow it. The Supreme Court would say that this violates the so far undefined basic principles of the Constitution. So it wasn't done. But she was aware, obviously, of the need from the power position point of view to centralize government in one person's hands. As far as whether it's too early to discuss the emergency, it will never be too early, it will never be too late. We are in a rolling situation. There'll always be scope for an emergency, and if the man on the white horse comes along, we'll probably have another emergency.
We have time for a few questions, so I'm opening it up to the audience. So, yes, I'll take it from the lady first, and then I'll come back to you.
I was a child of the emergency, and my parents were socialists who were opposing the emergency. So I actually used to understand the midnight knock, thinking that somebody would come to the house and take my parents away. And I saw many of their friends get into jail, and my father make posters to go and march to JP's call in Delhi, Delhi Chalo. And many years later, I saw some of the people who were fighting Mrs. Gandhi actually join hands with the BJP. And later, in the last 2 years, I've seen the BJP take advantage of their slight role during the emergency to say that they stand for civil rights, including Arun Jaitley's new book, Kumi Kapoor's new book, which Arun Jaitley launched in Delhi, called The Emergency. And I would like some of you to talk about the fact, and if you remember, that people in the BJP and the RSS used to be called the Mafi Khors. And when they were in jail, they were the first ones to apologize and come out and actually work with the regime. And how some of the ideas of the emergency now are getting mainstreamed into everyday political life, and how can we, as the people's movement, as you mentioned, how can we take this on when it becomes so mainstream and it's not targeted as during the emergency?
Ashok Malik?
I don't think that's a fair, with due respects, I don't think that's a fair comment, because while there were certainly Mafi Khors from the so-called right and from among the socialists perhaps, there were actually a vast number of people who were not Mafi Khors. And who spent, Arun Jaitley himself, since you mentioned him, spent close to 2 years in prison. He lost a year in college because Naveen Chawla refused to sanction a special examination center at Tihar jail, which the Delhi University authorities had agreed to. So people did suffer. Kumi Kapoor herself, if you read a book, you will know that she suffered, her small children suffered, her husband suffered for practically nothing other than just putting off Ambika Soni over a trifling argument. So to suggest that the RSS and the BJP had a slight role, I'm not suggesting they had a monopoly on the role of dissent, not at all, but to suggest they had only a slight role, I think is a bit unfair.
The main role was by JP and the socialists.
Well, we can, everyone had a role. I'm not going into who had 48% and who had 52%. So, and we don't know how many political prisoners were from one persuasion or the other, and I don't think that's relevant here. Coming to the tendencies of the emergency still being alive, I think we've discussed that earlier today and earlier in this panel. There is always a tendency for politicians across political lines to centralize, to control and to over-control. And I think it's less possible now in Delhi, not because people have suddenly become much better in Delhi, but because competing institutional correctives seem to exist at the national level and in Delhi more than they actually do in states. And which is why I feel state governments across political lines, I'm not pointing to one party or the other, and state chief ministers need much greater scrutiny than they get. Prime ministers and parties ruling in Delhi, again across political lines, get a lot of scrutiny. I think some of that scrutiny needs to be directed towards state governments, because that's where some of the egregious excesses still continue to take place.
The question there? Yes.
So we believe those who are in Bengal, we think that Siddhartha Shankar Rai had a greater role, and it is not Haksar so much. It is he who pegged on, that to Mrs. Gandhi that they should be an emergency in the country, and he had a greater role. I just want to know from the panel something more about this.
There is on record a letter from him to Mrs. Gandhi saying that under section so-and-so of the Constitution she could declare an emergency. So yes, his was the legal brain which sowed the germ of the idea in her mind. But then Siddhartha Shankar Rai wasn't a mafia leader like some of the people surrounding her, and they took over once she had acted on his advice. And then if you remember, going back to those years, or perhaps you won't remember, he fell out of favor. So it was no longer his influence which directed the emergency. But right at the beginning, he gave her the legal idea, yes.
Also, there is this piece of information, I don't know where it's recorded, but it is fairly well known in Delhi that in the corridors of power, that when the Allahabad High Court judgment came out, Haksar's advice as Principal Secretary to the Prime Minister was, you should resign. There is no way you can continue in power after this. Yes. Yeah. The mic, please.
I have been following the situation before emergency and after emergency till today as a student of political science and economics. I personally feel that in India, democracy has started as a synonym of majoritarianism. If the majorities want anything, that is legal, and that can be done even in an illegal way. And our situation today is such that law and order, in the sense that it protects liberty, is not existing throughout the country. Your reaction?
Would you like to react to that?
Well, it's very difficult to differentiate between majoritarianism and democracy, because democracy is the rule of numbers. It is how the majority exercises its authority that is of vital concern to the health of the nation. And yes, I'd agree with you that there is a tendency now for, let me put it this way, for the leaders to see themselves as sectarian chiefs and impose the beliefs of that group on the rest. And that is, if that is majoritarianism, then that is evil, because it doesn't respect the spirit of democracy. But as I said earlier, our leaders have always been too conscious of the letter of the law to respect its spirit. And if they can get away with it, they will get away with it.
The classic text, political theory-wise, the classic text on democracy and liberty is, of course, John Stuart Mill on liberty. And one of the points that Mill makes in that text is that even if there is one voice that has an opinion, that liberty of that voice must be guaranteed and must be heard. I think this is the spirit that we are increasingly losing in India.
Yeah. My question to Sunanda, the thing is that...
1 minute, please. Where was that? There was a question there. Yes. That.
Yeah, the question was that, as Sunanda had mentioned earlier, that direct election of the Prime Minister is not feasible, as had been put forward by one constitutional expert, and the Supreme Court will not allow it to do it. But what about some other constitutional experts, for example, Granville Austin and some others? Do they have the reaction regarding this, according to you, in fact?
No, I have no views on this. What I said was that Mrs. Gandhi felt that the Congress party was likely to lose the next election, but she herself retained her popularity. And so if she presented herself to the people as potential head of the government, she would romp home in triumph. And she tried to act on that belief through a constitutional amendment, but was advised that the Supreme Court would strike it down as being violative of the basic principles of the Constitution, which, as I said, have never been defined.
Ashok, does Granville Austin have a view on this?
No, I don't think, from what I remember, I don't think he takes a view on this. He just very meticulously describes the debate. But if I could add something there, we've had this debate for years. Vasant Sathe brought it up in the 80s again. Shashi Tharoor brought it up some years ago. I don't think it's really feasible, even if the constitution were to allow it, for India to now accept a directly elected prime minister or a directly elected president. Our politics is much too federal now to accept that. And in fact, our politics is more federal than our constitution really is. And much of the problems we are seeing now in terms of the relationship between Delhi and the states, again, irrespective of who's in power, is the fact that our constitution is just not federal enough. It's still much more unitary than our politics is. Our politics has moved far ahead of our constitution. And we need many more powers to be actually devolved to the states, and that's an ongoing process.
I think this is an important point you made, Ashok, that, and you should write about this, that our politics has become much more federal than our constitution actually is. Any other questions? Yes. The mic, please. Carry on.
This goes out to both the panelists. I mean, the way the emergency showed that the powers that were conferred by the constitution could be abused to such an extent, and since there is always the possibility of this recurring later on in the life of the Indian democracy, what, sirs, according to you, could be a measure to ensure that a thing like this does not tend to happen in future? Is there a machinery somewhere in the rule of law, maybe the ambit of constitutional law or general law, where one could actually fix responsibility and take action for some sort of compensation to be given to the state for the abuse of power? Or do you think any other method of checks and balances can be introduced? Because one emergency of this nature has shown the level of abuse. If this happens 50 years down the line, it will be worse still. Any reactions?
I don't see a way of transforming human nature by law. Men make laws and men unmake laws. Men break the laws that they make. And because it happened once doesn't mean it will have to happen again. The British cut off the head of a king. That doesn't mean they're going to cut off heads of kings forever. I said it was an aberration. It may not happen again. But Indian politics, Indian politicians are authoritarian. They do want to gather as much power in their hands, and this difference between the federal polity and the constitution that was mentioned earlier, we have ways of taking, looking after it, of making the most of it, if you like. Now, state PCCs, Pradesh Congress committees, elect their chiefs to be the chief minister. How do you think they elect the chief? They don't have a genuine election. They were told by the High Command, so-and-so will be the next chief minister, and they dutifully elected it. So our politics is tailored to our nature, and our nature is inherently authoritarian, if you like. I don't see how you can have a law to forbid abuse, because the abusers will then abuse those laws.
Could I? You know, at the root of the emergency, there were checks and balances possible even then. If the courts had been, if the Supreme Court had been more honest with its mandate, it could have checked some of the excesses of the emergency even in 75 or 76. But at the root of the emergency was not so much a system of checks and balances or competitive polity. It was Mrs. Gandhi's very complex personality, her set of insecurities going back to her childhood, to her relationship with her aunts, to her mother's relationship with her aunts, and how, as she grew as a politician, she transferred those insecurities and that paranoia, if I could use that word, from herself to her country. If the same set of complex parameters were to influence a future personality of a future prime minister, whoever he or she may be, could that person want to impose an emergency? Perhaps yes. Would it be as easy to, one, impose and two, maintain that emergency as it was between 75 and 77? Certainly not.
At one level, the emergency is also an act of human failure to stand up to power. I mean, if judges, including the then president, if he had said, I'm not going to sign this, I'm going to resign, things could have been different. We don't know, but things could have been different. Some people chose to kowtow.
There's a story that I think it's only a story, I haven't seen it reported, that as Jayaprakash Narayan was being taken to jail on that fateful morning, he looked out of his car window at a somnolent Delhi and said, why are the people not rising? Jayaprakash was an idealist who misjudged the nature of the Indian people. The people will never rise.
Yes.
Yes, one of the possible opportunities or rather chances of reimposing emergency in the future could be that there is an external threat to the country, a security threat, and hence an emergency has to be has to be implemented. Now, considering the fact that some portion or almost the entire portion of the PMO is kept outside the ambit of the RTI, which didn't exist in 1975 but now exists now, what do you think in this context? Can an emergency be imposed in the future or not?
In this an external emergency or an internal emergency?
No, an emergency within the country, an internal. In the context of RTI and
but we have been discussing the possibilities and the difficulties of imposing the internal emergency for the last 45 minutes. And we have been pointing to some of the difficulties that would arise if an emergency, if somebody had the brainwave again to impose the emergency. I don't think we should go once again reiterate that argument. We have been making this argument right through this program. Yes. One last question. The gentleman in the turban there, right at the back. Yes, he's got his hand up. Is there a mic there? Yeah. There. He's got his hand up.
Orange turban.
It's a little bit ironical that the words socialist and secular were enshrined in the constitution during the emergency. So my question is, what made Indira Gandhi do that? What was the most pressing reason? Was it that she wanted to show that good things were also happening during emergency? How should we take that this introduction of two words?
Ashok,
it's a very complex and interesting story about how those two words came in. You used this the expression good things happening during the emergency, and whether Mrs. Gandhi wanted to convey that. It's only in Calcutta that we still continue to hear that socialism could be a good thing. But having said that, please do read Granville Austin's Working a Democratic Constitution. There's a chapter on the Swaran Singh Committee, which comprises 12 Congress politicians, and how it negotiates the whole set of suggested amendments, many of which went into the 42nd Amendment. The word socialist was introduced by D.K. Barua. The word secular, I think, was introduced by A.R. Antule. Neither was actually Mrs. Gandhi's suggestion. And they had different reasons for bringing them in. The then Law Commission chief, who was a former Supreme Court Chief Justice, protested, saying that these words have been left undefined. You need to define these words. What does secularism mean? What does socialism mean? There was a reference to the Constituent Assembly debates and why the word socialist or the adjective socialist and the word secular were kept out of the preamble back then. There were good reasons that the drafters and framers of our constitution had. They didn't want to anticipate or prejudge how future generations would organize the economy. They also didn't believe that India was secular in the narrow Western political science sense of the term, because the Indian state is above religion, but not above religions, but not above religion. It has some religious duties. It makes religious concessions in the manner in which actually the state in the UK does as well, but not perhaps in Germany. But I would advise you to read Granville Austin's chapter on the Swaran Singh Committee. It's very educative.
Well, this session has come to an end. We have overrun our time. It remains for me to thank Sunanda Datta-Ray and Ashok Malik and Kiran Nagarkar in absentia for participating in the panel, and all of you for being such a marvelous audience. Thank you so much.